I see we have candidate Cal Mukamoto also joining us. Welcome, Cal. Jason, I see it's 2 o'clock. Are we ready to go live?
Yes, we are, Chair.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the October 20th, 2021 Board of Forestry virtual special meeting. We are live streaming this on YouTube, and to make sure our viewers online can follow along with today's items, I'll go over some housekeeping tips to keep us on track. Everyone participating or presenting, please silence cell phones and limit background noises. Remember to use the mute feature when you are not speaking and disable your video when not presenting or part of the discussion. For the record, we ask all presenters, public members, and board members to state their name for those listening online. If you experience any technical issues, use the chat function or Zoom to connect with our ODF support team during the meeting. For those joining us online, I'll remember everyone of our general order of operations. Today, there is one decision in front of the board for item 1, Senate Bill 762, Wildland Urban Interface Definition. After this item is introduced, I'll invite the presenters to begin. For board members, if you have clarifying questions, please use the raise hand function and I will call on you. Presenters, we will do our best to ask questions one at a time. After a presentation, we'll open the floor for board discussion and additional questions before a motion is made and voting is performed. This rulemaking item public comment period is closed, so no live testimony will be available. For item 2, we will be joined by the finalists for the state forester position and members of the public for the panel portion of this meeting. I will provide a brief overview of the recruitment process and further instructions at the beginning of this item for the public panel and finalists. Please note this item will be open for anyone who would like to submit written testimony. Please send in your comments by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, October 25th, in order for your testimony to be sent to the board for consideration and included with the meeting record. We ask that any submissions speak to the desired attributes and skills being sought by the board as we discuss these at the July 21st public meeting. To conclude our meeting today, the board will meet in a closed executive session starting at 5 p.m. Pursuant to ORS 192.660, parentheses 2, parentheses A, and parentheses 7, the board will be considering the employment of a chief executive officer. Representatives of the news media, finalists, and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. This session is otherwise closed to the public as no decisions will be made by the board. We will take a break before the virtual executive session begins and adjourn the public portion of the meeting. With that, any questions so far? To affirm we can meet quorum, I will perform a roll call to confirm board virtual attendance. Carla Chambers,
Here.
Ben Doimling,
Here.
Chandra Ferrari,
Here.
Joe Justice,
Here.
Brenda McComb,
Here.
and myself, Jim Kelly, am also here. Okay, moving on to item number 1, Senate Bill 762, Wildland Urban Interface Definition. I don't think I have any specific comments on this issue right now, but before we really get rolling, I would like to just make a couple of recognitions. One is that Doug Graff has gotten this new, very important wildfire job for the state of Oregon, and I just wanted to extend our congratulations to Doug. Very impressive. Following that, stepping in to his shoes on an interim basis at minimum is Mike Shaw. So Mike is with us today, and I wanted to give congratulations to Mike. Also wanted to mention that I'm not sure everyone is really aware of this, but a person who has been helping us this summer is Bill Hunt, who is retired from ODF and has been, I think, in a real instrumental role helping Nancy through this very, very, very busy time. And I think most of us got to meet Bill as he took a number of us on tours of fires this season. And so I just wanted to express my appreciation to Bill, and having spent a couple of days with him, I now consider him a real friend. So with that, I also understand that Acting State Forester Hirsch has some opening remarks on this item. So Nancy, would you like to start us off today?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Hirsch. I'm the Acting State Forester. And I don't know that Bill was observing the meeting today, but I'm sure he'll want to circle back and observe this. I know he will appreciate that feedback. Today, the department staff will be recommending that the board adopt a new definition for the wildland urban interface. While the recommendation definition is comprised of only 21 words, those words will reflect an important policy decision. Establishing the definition of the wildland urban interface is a critical first step towards the full implementation of Senate Bill 762. The wildland urban interface is at the core of many of the bill's key protections for communities and Oregonians. A great deal of work went into the development of this definition in a very short amount of time. This effort was time sensitive, as the legislature's direction was to have rules establishing the definition of the wildland urban interface in place within 100 days of the Senate Bill 762 being signed into law. The final results before you today mirrors the International Wildland Urban Interface Code's definition, and if adopted, would bring Oregon into alignment with its fellow Western states. The fact that we are here today and will meet the legislature's expectation is a testament to the incredible work of everyone who has been involved in the effort. The department appreciates the support of the board members who have engaged with the Rules and Rule Advisory Committee since its inception, the contributions of the 26 Rule Advisory Committee members who have committed a great deal of personal time to the goal of building a stronger foundation for Senate Bill 762 implementation, and the members of the public who attended RAC meetings and took the time to provide their feedback and input. While the establishment of a definition for the wildland urban interface will be a significant success for the department and its partners, the WUI-related rulemaking is far from over. As was mentioned earlier, the WUI definition is just the first milestone in a much larger effort. The considerable input that we have received through the Rules Advisory Committee and the rulemaking process will also serve to inform future rule development work. Rule language currently in development or on the horizon includes defining terms within the WUI definition and establishing criteria and risk areas or risk classes for the statewide wildfire risk map. Before we get into today's decision, I also wanted to recognize Mike Shaw, filling in here as the interim fire division chief. And I thought I would give Mike maybe just a couple minutes to share a little bit about himself before he'll turn the rest of the presentation over to Tim. So thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon, Chair Kelly, State Forester Hirsch, and members of the board. For the record, my name is Mike Shaw, and I'm currently serving as the interim Chief of Fire Protection for the agency. I know you have really important work to do today, and I don't want to get in the way of that, but did want to take maybe a minute of your time to provide a really brief introduction of myself. I've now worked for the agency for 22 years in both the private forests and the fire protection divisions, in both Northwest Oregon and in Eastern Oregon now. Most recently, prior to stepping into this role on Monday, just a couple of days ago, I served as the district forester for the Central Oregon District based out of Prineville, and that's been for the past 6 years. I'm really excited about this opportunity to serve in this role with the agency, and I look forward to working with and getting to know each of you folks better. So to close, I do want to take the opportunity to congratulate Tim Holschbach for his selection as the Deputy Chief of Policy and Planning. As you know, this is one of the positions that came with Senate Bill 762 and is critical to the success of the division. And Tim has been serving in the capacity recently, but was most recently selected to fill the position permanently. So I'm now going to turn it over to Tim, unless there are any questions from anybody. You're up, Tim.
Okay. Thank you, Interim Chief Shaw. Good afternoon, Chair Kelly, State Forester Hirsch, members of the board. For the record, my name is Tim Holschbach, and I serve as the Deputy Chief of Policy and Planning for the Protection Division with the Oregon Department of Forestry. This topic is a follow-up and a decision item related to the August 24th special Board of Forestry meeting, where the board directed the department to undergo the public hearing process related to rulemaking pertaining to the definition of wildland urban interface, which was directed through the enrollment of Senate Bill 762. Next slide, please. With this topic, I'll provide a brief overview of the requirements of Senate Bill 762, as State Forester Hirsch captured quite a few of them already. And as it pertains to the definition of the wildland urban interface, I'll provide a summary of the hearing officer's report in the public comment period, and which is found in attachment 4 of your board packet. And I will close with the decision item for this topic. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 762, the enrollment of that significantly amended Oregon's revised statutes 477, 015 through 064. There were several actions the bill directed the Board of Forestry to undertake regarding rulemaking. For this topic, we are focused on the definition of the wildland urban interface, which was directed to be adopted by rule within 100 days of the effective date of the bill. The effective date of the bill was July 19th. So that puts the 100-day deadline as October 27th. Attachments 1 and 2 in your board packet identifies the rule changes proposed by the department. including the removal of rules no longer supported by statute through those amendments, as well as the proposed definition of the wildland urban interface. Also related to, but not included in the decision topic today, is the criteria related to the classification of the wildland urban interface. And as State Forester Hirsch mentioned, this topic will be coming before the board, and it's scheduled for the March Board of Forestry meeting for that criteria. Next slide, please. Following the August 24th Special Board of Forestry meeting, the department filed notice of the proposed rulemaking, which is attachment 3 of the board packet, with the Secretary of State, and proceeded with the public comment process. 3 public hearings were held virtually, conducted through Zoom, where the department presented an informational briefing regarding the proposed rules and concluded each presentation with the conduction of the public comment portion of the hearing. In total, 28 members of the public joined those 3 hearings, with 5 individuals providing verbal comments. In addition, the department accepted written comment for 30 days and received 46 written comments regarding the rulemaking. Overall, 38 of the total comments were in support of the proposed definition and rule package. 7 were in opposition, and 6 provided information but were undecided. The primary opposition was that the definition proposed was too broad in nature. There were no comments pertaining to the revising of the unsupported rules. Next slide, please. The action item with this topic is as follows. With the completion of the public comment process, the department recommends that the board approves adoption of the revisions to Oregon Administrative Rules, Chapters 69, Division 44, as proposed in attachments 1 and 2 of the board packet. With that, I'll be ready for if there's any questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I would be remiss in also not congratulating you on your new position. I have, witnessed hours of you managing RAC committee meetings, and everything I've seen has been done so well with respect, with intelligence, and with knowledge. So with that, board members, is there anybody with a comment, or is anybody at this point willing to present a motion?
Raise hand.
Carla Chambers?
All right. So Tim, I think you did a great job, and there was a lot of comment, a lot of feedback, a lot of public participation. Could you give us, we had 2 motions at the beginning relating to WUI, relating to this definition. Could you talk to us a little more about some of the opposition and give us a little more information in terms of what their concern, what some of those primary concerns were?
I clicked on accidentally muted myself. The primary concerns are with as most definitions are a little vague. We're working through the process currently of working through the criteria of identifying how the terms, a definition's 20 plus words in this case, but it does set a policy standard. But as we develop the terms of how those terms interrelate to each other, terms like wildland fuels and vegetative fuels, how it relates to meets and intermingles, what structures and human development means. So it's as we go through those process in itself, in the proposed definition, the comments received in opposition to the proposed definition were that those comments were vague, and being further refined as we move forward. They'll be all defined in the March package that's presented to the board, as well as how those relate to the statewide risk mapping process as well, which was section 7 of the bill. So those processes are combining together as we move forward, and that will be presented to the board in one package holistically in March.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, what we are looking for specifically here is a motion to approve the adoption of the revisions to OAR 629-044, seen in attachment 2.
This is Brenda McComb. I so move.
Do we
Second,
have a second?
second,
Shonda Ferrari, seconds motion. We have a motion and a second, and I'd like all board members to be unmuted, and I will do a roll call on this motion. Carla Chambers,
Aye.
Ben Doimling,
Aye.
Shonda Ferrari,
aye.
Joe Justice,
Aye.
Brenda McComb,
Aye.
and I am an aye as well. With the board reaching consensus, this motion carries. Again, just want to express my appreciation to Tim and to his staff, who have really been doing a great job with the work that was to us. They've got lots more work to do. So we will be able to, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, but there's not much wrong with that. Does anybody have any comment before we take a quick break? Hearing nothing, we will take let's make it a 15-minute break here. And my clock says 2:19. Let's call that 2:20, and let's meet back at 2:35. So we are on break.
As we're preparing to re-engage from our break, I'm just going to invite the 3 panel members who are able to join us and all of our finalists to do a quick video and mic check. This is Hillary from Board Administrator.
This is Terry O'Rourke.
Thank you, Terry.
Finalist.
Hi, this is Cal Mukamoto.
Hi, Cal. Welcome.
Hi, you heard me. Okay.
I did. And I can see you. I'm just circling through.
Okay.
Hi there, this is Jim Paul.
Hi, Jim. I'm just checking to see if I can see your video. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much.
This is
This is Ron Byers. Ron Byers, is my mic okay?
Yes, Ron, you will be panel member number 3. Thank you very much for joining us. Next up,
Thank you.
either James or Terry.
Sure. So this is James. I'm another panel, or I'm another person asking a question.
Okay, thank you.
Terry Harris. Good to see you guys.
Thank you for joining us, Terry. Okay, we'll just hold on there for a few and we'll be ready to pick up. And Jim, Chair Kelly, just want to let you know, we do have a couple panel members still joining us, but since we're ahead of schedule, they may not be quite here yet. So feel free to take all your time that you need for your overview and introduction to this item too.
Okay, thank you. All right, we are back in session. And so welcome to the panel members that we do have so far and to our candidates. Thank you for being here. So far we've gotten quite a ways through this process of recruitment. We were required by statute early on to have several public meetings where we took testimony from the public, from stakeholders. We got through that whole process. We also then had what it's called the vidrecruiter process, where each candidate was interviewed and each board member was able to watch and rate each candidate based on that process. And then there was a panel that interviewed the candidates, a panel of employees, and that occurred, what is it now? It's over a week ago. And then lastly, each of the candidates met with the governor's office. And this is the next step in the process to do these questions in this public forum. Following this, we'll have an executive session and discussion. We will not be making a decision today. We will be making our decision on a meeting, special meeting on the 29th of this month. So board members, since we're a little bit ahead of schedule, any other comments? And also, if Hillary, if you can let me know when those other panelists join us. Okay. I don't see any other comments. So Hillary, let me be clear, we've got 3 of our 5 panelists, is that correct?
Yes, Chair Kelly. We out of total, we have 8 questions for the finalists today. And it looks like 3 of our panel members were able to make it. So since we do have them in order, I could be wrong, we do have a facilitator for the public panel. So I would like to hear from ODF Public Affairs representative and our facilitator, Jason Cox, if he has any issue with us moving forward with the current 3.
Thank you, Hillary. Chair Kelly, for the record, I'm Jason Cox, Public Affairs Specialist for the Oregon Department of Forestry. We've had a couple more folks with questions trickling in while we're while we've been talking. So hopefully we'll have a couple more show up, and we have a couple questions at the end from folks who already let us know they couldn't be here today. So for this portion of the meeting, the department sought questions from members of the public to ask finalists to be Oregon's next state forester. The agency received about 75 questions, and the following questions were chosen by the board chair. As Chair Kelly referenced earlier, the Board of Forestry is scheduled to vote on hiring the next state forester at its October 29th meeting. To provide comment on this, please email boardofforestry@oregon.gov, or to sign up to provide comment at the meeting, visit the ODF website. Chair, you ready to proceed?
Yes, I am. Thank you. All right, for this topic, I will moderate the questions asked by the public participants and call on the finalists to respond to the questions. The board administrator will track the time offline, as we would like the public panelists to interface with the finalists as much as possible. I encourage the board to act as observers and listen for how the finalists respond in relation to the desired attributes, skills, and experiences sought for this position. Public panelists, I will ask each of you to engage your video and mic, use gallery view, and to briefly introduce yourself before asking your question of the finalists. Finalists, you will have 3 minutes to consider and respond to the question. When your time is exhausted, you will be prompted to conclude your answer. After a panelist completes their question, I will call upon the finalists in a different order each time, so be prepared to engage. So for example, the question 1 turns out to be candidate A, then B, candidate B, and then candidate C will have a chance to answer the same question. And then the next question, we would start with whoever candidate B or C was from the first question. I think you get the idea, so that we can be as fair as possible to all the candidates. And then a quick reminder to the public panel to please stick with the original question that you submitted, as they were selected to offer the board and members of the public tuning into this meeting an opportunity to hear the finalists' perspectives on a variety of issues today. Okay, before the panel begins, I want to invite each finalists to introduce themselves and summarize their background experience for the board and public panel. You will have 5 minutes each. And if we can start with candidate Cal Mukamoto.
So thank you, Chair Kelly. My name's Cal Mukamoto, and I'm a candidate for state forester. Now, my career has been long and windy, and I've done a lot of different things. I started out as a forester for Colorado State Forest Service in Colorado. And of course, that's repetitive, but but I managed the fire protection program for the district, and also did beetle control and things like that. It was a great experience in the Rocky Mountains. But since I was educated in the West at Humboldt State University in forestry, I came west and I went to work for the Makah tribe up in Washington, and that gave me a start in Indian forestry. You know, I also received a MBA from the University of Washington, which gives me kind of a dual look. I have a business background also, and I also have a forestry management background. I've worked for tribes for many years. I think I've also volunteered for the state as chair of the Parks Commission, and also am the vice chair for the Oregon Department of Forestry Board of Forestry. So it's giving me what people say an inside outside look to state government. I think my background, just give a quick background, I did a lot of turnaround management. And although I don't think ODF is in a turnaround situation because we have such a strong board and we have strong managers, I do think some of the techniques I used in turnaround management could become useful in this situation. So I think that if you want someone with a little bit different background, I'm the one, maybe potentially, that you would want to choose. Now, a little bit, some of my outside activities, I've been on about 6 tribal boards, enterprise boards. I've been on the board for this Forest Stewardship Council for the United States. I believe in the Forest Stewardship Council. I've also harvested timber. I think I've harvested probably almost a half billion board feet in my lifetime. So I know about how you harvest timber and why it's important for the economic segment of our society. Getting back to the Forest Stewardship Council, I just want to let you know that I'm part of the social chamber because I really believe that the three houses, the economic, the social, and the environmental chambers, I believe that being a part of the social chamber is important because that's where ultimately our responsibilities for managing forests come to fruition. And so that's me. If you have any other questions, I've worked in forestry, I've managed forests, and I've worked with tribes. I've worked with ODF as a board member, and I've worked with other government agencies. One other thing I've done is worked on the local collaborative levels on the Metolius, for example. I was the chair of the collaborative group down there for 8 years. And I think right now, working with our audience, collaboration is a big skill that should be used in managing our public assets. Did I meet the time frame there, Chair Kelly?
I wasn't the timekeeper. It looked
Oh,
like
okay. I felt like someone was going to at least tell me when I was going over. So
I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. We're going to move to our next candidate for introduction of themselves. Terry O'Rourke.
Hello, everyone. My name's obviously Terry O'Rourke, and my background is in general natural resources management. I have an undergrad in forestry from Michigan State University, so shout out to the Spartans. And I have a master's in environmental science and policy, focusing on economics, socio, community use of forest products. And my work background is 17 years with the U.S. Forest Service, 7 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, specifically focusing on water management, hydrology, waters mitigation. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 5 years working on habitat conservation planning, and reclamation in Klamath Falls in a very dry year, which was a very long year. And currently with NOAA Fisheries, working extensively with the state of Oregon, with the State Forest Division on the Western Oregon State Forest Habitat Conservation Plan, also working on the Private Forest Accord. So my background is in really forestry, biology, hydrology. I consider myself an ecologist, and the majority of the work that I've done has been in partnership with others. I believe that facilitating solutions, working with others, and keeping the base in place-based local community roots for forest products and for the socio and economic aspects of forestry and natural resource management is really the base of my background and how I see us moving forward with the state of Oregon. I have a strong facilitation background. I have worked extensively with a number of different agencies. I facilitated the Region 6 Regional Foresters leadership team for the Forest Service. And I think a lot of what is needed in a state forester is listening and working with people and facilitating solutions. And I have a good background to do that.
Okay, thank you, Terry. And up now is candidate Jim Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to meet you virtually. Let's see, I will in 5 minutes, what can I tell you in 5 minutes? I'll start back sort of at the beginning and move through fairly quickly so I don't get too bogged down in my past. I actually was almost born, but raised in Hawaii. Grew up my entire childhood there until I left to come to the Pacific Northwest to go to college. Graduated from Whitman College with a politics degree. I believe it was called political science back then. And my senior year was when the spotted owl wars were blowing up, and it was fascinating to me. I was fascinated by the politics of it. I was fascinated by the human aspect of it. And it's what really ignited a fire in me to actually want to get into forestry. I quickly realized that I didn't know anything about forestry. And if I were to think I could be successful in a policymaking role, in a management role, in a leadership role, I probably needed to know something about it, have some foundation. So I went back to school. I went to the Duke University's College of Forestry, Masters of Forestry program, spent a year there, and then decided that I really wanted to focus on the water issues side. And I knew I wanted to be back in the Pacific Northwest. So I transferred to University of Washington and completed my Master's of Science in Forest Hydrology there in 1996. I came to forestry actually at that time and originally worked in their monitoring program. And over the course of 10 years, went through a number of positions. The longest held one during that time was as the agency's hydrologist. Incredible experience. Over about 4 years, I got to travel all across the state dealing with just fascinating issues. Spent a lot of my time on fish passage and writing and rewriting guidance on our fish passage at the time. Also on riparian protection issues and working through rule and policy issues, actually directly with the Board of Forestry. The department gave me a great opportunity, even in that role, to do a lot of presenting, issue paper drafting. In fact, Cal Mukamoto, we go back then, he was on the board then, and I think I gave a few presentations in front of you, Cal. You know, when we got to around 2010, I'd been, you know, a lot of my career under my belt with forestry, and I wasn't sure where my direction was going, but I knew that I wanted to broaden my perspective and that could only help me. I ended up moving over to the Department of State Lands as an assistant director, did that for 6 years under their land management division, overseeing the management of their common school fund lands, of which a big chunk of the revenue created off that portfolio is from forest management. And then I was appointed to the director of that agency and secretary to the State Land Board, and did that for 2 years. So I know what it's like to report to a board chair, although the board chair of that board is the governor of Oregon, was Kate Brown, but the treasurer, Tobias Reed, as well as the secretary of state, Dennis Richardson, who sadly has passed away since then. And then in 2018, I got another itch to broaden my horizons and experience an entirely different new type of organization and agency, and moved to the Department of Corrections, a 4,500 employee agency. And that's been quite an experience, sort of to add to my knowledge around how to govern, how to manage organizations, lead people, especially a large group of people, and really get things accomplished, you know, in an agency and an organization that size. I think, you know, in 1 minute left, I think I would just wrap up here by telling you, when it comes to the state forester role, the statute pretty clearly articulates the 3 major areas of leadership that position requires. One is around being a forester, a practical forester with experience in Western conditions. The others, as it states, the CEO of the department, and finally, of course, the secretary to the board. And I think this position requires somebody who has skills in all 3 of those areas, that a board and an agency can have confidence in that they have those skills. And I think if you look at my my resume, my background, and hopefully get to know me a little better here over the course of the next couple hours, I think you'll see that I definitely have acquired many of those skills in my 25 years career. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, candidates. Each of you, impressive backgrounds. So that's a great start. You know, I was just thinking I wanted to share one thing before we go to the next step, and that's I had a conversation this last week with Jim Brown. Jim was sort of the last state forester who lasted for very long, was a successful run. And Jim said that when he was hired, one of the board members at that time, John Shelk, confided with him after the hiring process. He said, John said, we weren't really looking for a state forester. We were looking for somebody who could become a state forester. And Jim Brown said, took me about 7 years in the job before I really felt I had my arms around it. Anyhow, I thought that was great wisdom and wanted to share that with our fellow board members. We'll see how this goes for the rest of our question time. If we do have enough time at the end of the questioning period, we'll allow for some closing comments by the candidates. For transparency, the first candidate selected to kick off the public panel was chosen at random, and for each question posed by the public will be rotated for a different candidate to respond. So with that, any questions?
No, but I will speak up.
Yes, go ahead.
For the record, Board Administrator Hillary Olivos-Rude, Chair Kelly, and members of the board. So I did put everybody's of the finalists, thank you for joining us today, into a random generator. And to start us off on the first question, which then, Chair, I will defer to you to rotate through the different finalists for each of those subsequent questions, will be in the following order for the first question. First up, Mr. Paul. Second up, Mr. Mukamoto. Third up, O'Rourke. So thank you very much. And I will be tracking your time throughout each of the questions.
Okay, thank you, Hillary. All right, with that, I think we are ready to move to the question process here. So first up's going to be Paul, and go ahead and introduce our panelists, please.
Fantastic. Again, Chair Kelly, for the record, Jason Cox, Public Affairs at ODF. I'll now introduce the first panelist, James Perini. And I apologize if I got that last name wrong, but you are up. Feel free to introduce yourself and ask your question.
That was perfect, Jason. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Kelly and the board. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to ask a question. Jim, I look forward to hearing from you. Again, my name is James Perini. I'm a PhD student at the Oregon State College of Forestry, studying wildland fire management and governance. I started my career fighting fire for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde before spending 4 years in Washington, D.C., working for Senator Jeff Merkley and Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici. After that, I worked for the Nature Conservancy, traveling around and helping with their fire adapted communities network. And now I'm back in Oregon in grad school. So appreciate the opportunity. Here's my question. So Jim, how do you think new appropriated funding for fire prevention should be applied across Oregon? Should certain geographies or fire-prone WUI communities, like those representing vulnerable or historically disenfranchised groups, be prioritized in the application of mitigation strategies like prescribed fire, thinning, and Firewise planning and outreach?
James, thank you for the question. Quite a big question. And in some respects is sort of the $60 million question. I think wildfire risk reduction and the fire program funding in general is the highest, maybe next to climate change, issue that the department and the board have to wrestle with right now. And in terms of where we go from there on this issue, and with everything you've mentioned, I want to preface sort of my answer with to give you a little context around what makes me tick. So I am, you'll find that I'm a pragmatist at core. People who know me know I'm not an ideologue. What's really important for me are following good principles and following good process. In addition to being clear around public officials, governance bodies being clear on their roles and responsibilities, their line of authority. So in listening to that question, and generally when I'm asked on what's your position on, what would you do with, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, what's the underlying interest to the public here, or the agency, or to the stakeholder group? In this case, it's Oregonians, right? It's all Oregonians. They're like never before in the history have more Oregonians felt potentially impacted by fire. So it's definitely a big tent question and big tent issues we have to wrestle with. And I find that when you get to talking about asking the question, what's in the public interest, I find that as human beings, we have a lot more in common than we think, as opposed to talking about positions and getting very positional. And I think that's the key to really resolving controversial issues, where you're talking about issues here on how do you allocate funds, even though there's quite a bit of funds that have been passed and that we're looking at how to allocate. You're still allocating. There's still going to be winners and losers. Really difficult questions from a policy making and a public purpose perspective. So to me, in the role of an agency director or state forester, the very next question is where the authority lies. Who should be answering that question? As a human being, I may have my opinions about it, may have my leanings, but if this is a big picture question around the state of Oregon, that's likely a Board of Forestry question, right? So my role would be, how do I bring this issue in front of the board? How do I make sure the board has all of the most relevant information it needs? How do I organize that and support them in a way that makes sure they can make a timely decision? These are issues that can't wait. These are issues probably should have been resolved a couple of years ago when the first major fire seasons really started blowing up. So we're playing a little bit of catch up. Personally, as a state forester, I would, as long as we're following correct principles, which would be guided by statute, policy, rules, and as long as we feel like we are vetting the right information and have the best information in front of us, my role would be to guide the board to make the decisions they need to, and then to implement those effectively. As a CEO of a large organization like Forestry, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where it really matters when we're policy making. What does that mean on the ground? What's going to happen for Oregonians? So, not a direct answer to the question maybe you were thinking, but those are my thoughts, and that's kind of my perspective on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Terry, you're up with your 3 minutes for this same question.
So the question regarding wildfire risk reduction and whether or not traditionally underrepresented groups should be prioritized. I think as far as anything that ODF does, we should be doing significantly more outreach and inclusion for any traditionally underrepresented groups. As part of the work that I've been doing with ODF, I've seen a huge willingness to work collaboratively and to learn about reaching out to others. I've been working with some of the ODF staff regarding reaching out to the tribes and being more inclusive with tribal members and tribal councils to make sure that not only are we getting information out to the tribes, but we're also receiving information from the tribes about what their priorities are, what they want to see, what their experience is. So regardless of what we're doing, whether it's timber management, recreation, or wildfire risk reduction, outreach, I think, is incredibly important. Inclusion of traditionally underrepresented groups is absolutely part of what I would see as my role as state forester, is making sure that that is being done, and then listening to those folks who have not been traditionally been included in the process, and making sure any new ideas or old ideas or thoughts that people who haven't been involved in the process have can be incorporated into the decision-making process, how we move forward with managing our forests. Regarding wildland risk reduction, I would focus on where the biggest issues are for wildland risk. It's easy to say, oh, we'll do it here or we'll do it there, but I think really using data and the analysis tools that are out there to identify areas of risk are really important. For the windstorm that we had in 2020 that really drove an unprecedented level of fires in areas that weren't necessarily identified as super vulnerable. That's one thing I think we need to look at into the future. Southwestern Oregon and Central South Oregon are extremely vulnerable. And I think that's going to be an area that we continue to focus on. There's a lot of need to do things like WUI reduction of fuels around urban and rural communities, structures. And so I think really taking the data, using it to move forward is the way that I would move out on that. I think my time is up.
All right, thank you, Terry. Cal, it's your opportunity to answer question number 1 here.
Okay, can I start by, can you repeat that question? Because my speaker broke up when you were in the middle of it, and I didn't know if I heard it right. So
I'm happy to. Is that all right across the board if I repeat the question quickly? Okay, I'm seeing nods from the proctors. Okay. So the question is, and thanks, Cal, for that. How do you think new appropriated funding for fire prevention should be applied across Oregon? Should certain geographies or fire-prone WUI communities, like those representing vulnerable or historically disenfranchised groups, be prioritized in the application of mitigation strategies like prescribed fire, thinning, and fire-wise planning and outreach?
Okay, thank you, Jim or James. Let me say one thing I want to say is that all communities deserve to be protected from fire. And we, I think with the latest appropriations for that, we want to make sure that that occurs. Now, how we do that is going to be a lot like, I think what I've heard before here, that we need to go out and work and be collaborative and find out where these areas are, use data, find out where they are, and then use the process that we have to make sure that we're distributing the monies on a fair basis. Fairness and inclusiveness is a couple of principles that I really think that, managing these types of programs must be integrated in doing that. I heard the words tribes being brought up, and I know that, tribes are all not the same. And some tribes, I work a lot with the Warm Springs tribes, for example. They have a very sophisticated infrastructure for understanding how to deal with, wildland fire risk reduction. But then you get to some of the smaller tribes, and they may not have that support. And I think that, being good partners and being people who are being across that, looking for those communities, especially like, for example, tribal communities outside the reservation that might be at risk, and talking about what sort of things, education, so on and so forth, are good things that we should be working on. It's not an easy thing, because anytime you start spreading dollars around and giving people benefits, everyone wants to have their fair share. But I think in order to do this, we still need to be on that principle. Everyone deserves a safe life from fire. And I think we need to keep that in mind. But I think we also need to go by the process, involve the Board of Forestry where appropriate, and work with these groups in more of a collaborative fashion and educational fashion.
Okay, thank you very much. That completes our question number 1 here. And Jason, if you can introduce our panelists for the next question, and we can get that question asked. And this time our order will be Cal, then Paul, then Terry.
Thank you, Chair. Next question is from Terry Harris. Terry, go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thanks so much to the board and the panelists for taking questions. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm Terry Harris. I am a longtime enviro. I'm a non-Oregon attorney, now living in Portland. I worked in environmental issues in Maryland and Idaho and a little bit in California. And so I've got experience elsewhere, but not so much here. I'm on the Oregon chapter of the Sierra Club's executive committee, and I do a lot of volunteer environmental work for organizations throughout the state. My question is, what is your view of the role of DEQ in Oregon forestry? How do you see your role in cooperation and collaboration with DEQ in air quality and water quality issues arising in forests?
Well, thank you for that, Terry, that question. You know, on DEQ, I guess one of the things I want to say is that we have an obligation to Oregonians to provide the cleanest air, cleanest water, and it's even stated in the greatest permanent value that those are important objectives. So I think with the role with DEQ, it should continue where DEQ, for example, on pesticides, there are rules on whether a pesticide is safe, but I think we should talk about the applications that we use it in forestry. And I think we need to inform them how they're done and monitor. I think monitoring is something that we don't, well, I'm not saying that generally that's an area that we need to probably intensify so we know what the results are. I think there should always be a dialogue between agencies, cross collaboration, and exchange of information that allows us to create that best practices out there. What I want to say is that we always need to go back to the original goal, and that's providing a safe and clean environment for Oregonians. With that said, I think DEQ, when I was on the Board of Forestry, there have been times when other agencies like Department of Agriculture or DEQ have informed us on applications of pesticides, herbicides, and other areas. And I think those have been quite useful in informing our decision on the board. I think we need to continue to work in that manner and continue to keep in mind the goal, the greatest permanent value.
Okay, thank you. Cal, next up is Jim.
Yes, Terry, thank you for that question. Apologize in advance if I get a little too scientific and technical in my answer. This is a topic that goes back to earlier years in my career. I know right now the Board of Forestry, you've been in conversations with DEQ recently and their commission about updating the sufficiency analysis, ODF DEQ sufficiency analysis on water quality. The original document was completed back in 2002. And as the hydrologist of the agency at the time, I was the lead technical expert in terms of putting that document together. It was definitely a group effort with other specialists within forestry. I think we actually had three at the time that were trained, had their master's degree in hydrology and were very familiar with the issues around water quality specifically. Of course, that document was focused on water quality and not the air quality that I know you've asked about. The role of DEQ in forestry at its very base is very simple. DEQ sets the water quality standards and the TMDL standards, and forestry must follow them. Forestry must comply. And that document at the time was right when TMDLs were sort of relatively new. That's probably not the right word, but we were trying to get our feet under how they related to water quality standards. And it was sort of our first shot at how we were going to look at forestry and ensure that they would meet those standards. I definitely agree that it's time to update that document. Ideally, at the time, what we were looking for was to come to agreement, if we could, with DEQ, even if that meant some potential changes, that the Department of Forestry's Forest Practices Act would be the compliance mechanism for meeting water quality. We didn't get there at the time. It sounds like we're not there now, potentially. But I think that's the ideal, right? It gives predictability for any forester, any landowner working in the woods that wants to know they're in compliance with water quality, that if they can say, I'm in compliance with the Department of Forestry's laws, therefore I'm in compliance with water quality, that would be ideal. But that would come under an agreement, under negotiations, under working through the issues to make sure that was in fact the case. We need to look at the science. But ultimately, the DEQ sets the standards and forestry needs to demonstrate that we're meeting those standards. Now, ultimately, those standards in large part stem from the Federal Clean Water Act. And in some states, it's the federal government that enforces those standards and rules. in Oregon, in large part, we do, if my memory serves. It's been a little while since I've been immersed in the topic. But yeah, I think the relationship is pretty straightforward in terms of what's required. Executing and making sure we're doing it in a way that works and it doesn't have any unintended outcomes, unintended consequences, and is satisfying the Clean Water Act is, that's the work that we're doing. It sounds like we're still doing and need to make sure we're continuing in the future.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Next up, Terry, same question.
I think it's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up and really putting water quality as a focus of the State Forester panel. So the role of DEQ, obviously they're overseeing the water quality standards and air standards. And as State Forester, working cooperatively with them in collaboration with them is going to be critical to success for every aspect of forestry, for wildfire management, working with them regarding air quality standards, being able to implement prescribed burning, being able to open that window for air quality so that prescribed burning isn't just a theory, that it can actually be implemented. When I worked with Forest Service doing the prescribed burning, air quality issues and trying to meet a tiny little window really limited the amount of prescribed burning that we could do. So I think it's absolutely critical that ODF and DEQ are working together to make sure that air quality is looked at from the big picture perspective, knowing that air quality is one of the big issues that has been negatively affecting Oregonians in the last couple of years and will likely continue. So thinking big picture about air quality and opening that window for more prescribed burning, I think is going to be really important. Water quality, working on the HCPs with state forests and possibly private lands, I think is going to address a lot of the issues that are important for forestry, but also for sustainable fisheries and also for drinking water, especially with those small rural communities that are so dependent on forested lands for drinking water. So I think that DEQ and ODF have been working very cooperatively. That's been my observation. And I think the MOU that is the recent MOU that's come about, I think is another step forward. I think all the different state agencies play a role, but I think one of the most important partnerships that is out there is going to be with DEQ. I do have background working for the Corps of Engineers regulatory with the Federal Clean Water Act. I've worked extensively with a number of states with the Clean Water Act, so I feel very comfortable working with DEQ, working with our other partners who have that water-oriented background. As a regulator and as a land manager, I can bring both of those areas to the table. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, candidates. We're going to move on now to question number 3 here. And Jason will introduce our next panelist. This time, Terry, you get to go first. Then it will be Cal, followed by Jim. Jason?
Next question is from Ron Byers. Ron?
Thank you. I'm Ron Byers. I live on the Trask River outside of Tillamook. I've been here for, well, over 20 years. And especially in the last few years, I've become concerned that we have a growing water crisis on the Oregon coast. I know a lot of Oregon can make the same claim, but it's surprising that the Oregon coast would have a water problem. Much of our water comes out of the Tillamook and Clatsop State Forest. So you see the role you have to play in that. So my question is, how much priority would you give to protecting forest watersheds that supply water, especially drinking water, to neighboring communities? And how would you implement this priority?
Terry? Or excuse me.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
I'll make sure I'm on. Yep. I appreciate the question, and I'll just build on my last answer where I was talking about the importance of drinking water. And most recently, I've been working with the State Forest HCP, and one of the focus areas is, of course, Northwestern Oregon and the Tillamook and Clatsop, and drinking water and sustainable fisheries go hand in hand. Local communities, especially coastal communities, are extremely dependent on forested ecosystems, forested watersheds. So I think moving forward, whether the HCP happens or doesn't happen, I think it's a very important priority for ODF, for local communities. There's a big focus and emphasis on timber harvest and timber for communities. I also believe communities value drinking water and the water supply for people in those communities from the forest. So I think looking at all of the benefits, all of the ecosystem services that are provided by the forests, with water being the priority and timber being one of the products that we can have if we manage sustainably and we manage in a climate smart way, we can have both. It doesn't have to be either or, but it does have to, I do think there has to be a priority on looking at where the water supply is coming from and making sure that if there is active management in the area, that it's done in a way that's sustainable and supports local community water supplies. So how I would implement that is working with communities and mapping out where the drinking water is, the drinking water supply, and seeing what the impacts of different management would be, different management regimes within the forests on drinking water. I'm currently in Ireland, which you would think would never be running out of water, but I've done a lot of walks around some of the reservoirs and lakes here, and they're at about 1/3 normal water supply in Ireland. And I think as you run out of water, it becomes more and more valuable. And as we're seeing the drought that has been the norm in Oregon for the last 20 years take effect on local communities, on water supplies, on our forests, water is becoming more and more of an issue, which is surprising in Oregon, especially in Western Oregon, but it is a critical issue and priority.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Next up, Cal, you get to answer the same question.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ron, for that question. Again, I have to say, of course, everyone deserves adequate amounts and clean water. And, when I worked on the Macaw Indian Reservation years and years and years ago, we had that situation where we were running out of water in the summertime, and then the wintertime rains hit, you would see your water turned a little brown. And as a consumer of that water, it really was kind of upsetting. That's why I think people who live with, that's why tribes are great, because they live with the consequences of their forest management. And we got to keep that in mind when we manage our forests. One of the things that prompted us to go out and start looking, since I was a forest manager, and seeing what past forest management practices were in the area affecting our water such. And I think that's something we need to do. So how would I implement trying to maintain clean water? Well, first off, I don't want to circumvent the fact that we would have a panel of experts within the ODF, and we could reach out to others as we do state planning. And I think that identifying who's going to be affected by it, where the water is coming from, and what type of issues we have as far as how much do we have, and what's the cleanliness and the quality of the water needs to be looked at. And then I'll finally say we need to follow the law. When Jim was talking about TMDLs, it reminded me that back then we had this study called Ripstream, and I remember that. And I was on the board of Forestry, and it basically said if you exceeded certain TMDLs, you need to go for ruling on riparian zones setbacks. And, we exceeded it in Ripstream. And, my sole goal there was we need to follow the law. So if we're violating the law on anything, I think we just need to follow the law. I voted for going for rulemaking, and I paid the price from people saying we caused all sorts of problems. But, principally, you have to follow the law, and that's something I'll follow. So I hope that, gives you comfort that, I do think that's important. I understand from living in the situation that the water quality is very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cal. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, great question, Ron. First off, protecting drinking water is the highest priority, right? It's fundamental to human survival and livelihood. Everyone has a right to clean drinking water. And we have federal laws on the books that have standards around clean drinking water that should be followed. When it comes to talking about, what does that mean on the ground? You got to think about two different pieces of that equation from a bigger picture. You have the quality of the water coming into a treatment plant, whatever that plant is like, whether that's a really rudimentary, small type of plant in rural Oregon, maybe that does not have the ability to filter, like say a plant in Wilsonville, which I believe recently the plant opened up where they right in the Willamette River, and they had the technology and the funds to build a plant that could filter that water and create drinking water that met federal standards. So when we talk about providing clean drinking water, we need to think about the environment, right? As we talked about earlier, in-stream water quality standards are a must. We have to meet those. At a minimum, that's how clean the water needs to be before it's going into any intake. At the outtake, federal laws and state laws require what that drinking water needs to be as well. And we should be following those as well. Where it gets complicated, of course, is that we have rural communities, very small communities that do not have very robust water treatment facilities. Some don't have any, some have virtually any. And small changes in water quality in those streams can have a big impact on what the water quality is coming out of the other end, coming out of their spigot. And we need to pay attention to that. We cannot sort of write that off and say, well, we're good enough with water quality in stream that we need to follow on forestry. And I think that's been reflected historically in the Forest Practices Act, where there has been a distinction, I believe, for most of the act between protections around water source areas versus protections in other type of environments. And that's changed over time. The fact that we're still talking about it tells me that we still don't have it right? We still need to figure this out. I know my understanding is Senate Bill 1602 creates some new protections that could potentially address this issue better. I haven't looked at it that closely, so I couldn't speak to that, but it's clearly an issue in the forefront of Oregonians' minds that as state forester, I would work with the Board of Forestry and staff to look at where are the issues. Is it a fundamental issue that the board needs to speak to in terms of some rulemaking? Is it on the other hand, is an issue around rule implementation that the department just needs to do, make sure we're doing what the department needs to do to address. So a lot of pieces to it, but those are my thoughts around that. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Jim. We're going to move to our next question number 4, and we'll have Jason introduce our panelists. This time the order will be Jim, then Cal, then Terry. Jason?
Good Chair. Next up is Paul Betts.
Yeah, thank you, board, for having me. My name is Paul Betts. I'm a 4th generation Oregonian, 3rd generation in the woods. My father and grandfather were loggers. I moved over to the professional side of the industry, and I manage Miami Corporation's Oregon Tree Farm. It's a coastal tree farm just outside of Grand Ronde. Owned the ground for a little over 100 years and have managed it sustainably for the family that owns us for that time. So, candidates, congratulations on making it this far, and I'm interested in hearing your answer to this question. It's a little bit more open-ended than some of the previous questions. And I'd like to know, what are the greatest problems facing Oregonians that you think ODF can help solve, and how should the agency go about doing this work?
Great,
Hey, Jim?
Yep. Thinking about how nice it is when you don't have to go first with these questions. the greatest problems to solve for Oregonians. Well, I mean, it's interesting. So in the context of this recruitment, of this position, and of this board, it tumbles to the fundamental question about what is within the board's purview and therefore the department's purview to address in terms of what's most important for Oregonians. What are the things that forestry touches that affect all Oregonians, and which should probably be a pretty big driver and factor into our priorities. And I think they are, from what I've seen and learned over the last few months in where the department's at and where the board is at. The wildfire risk reduction, as I mentioned earlier, is impacting more Oregonians. I think in the latest polling, more Oregonians than ever. I think a fire is potentially impacting them, as they should, given just the crazy fire seasons and events that have happened over the last few years. And then climate change, right? Forestry, 30 million acres of forests in Oregon, record acres burned, climate change and what forestry can do around both adapting and coping with it, as well as trying to mitigate, doing our part we can to mitigate in that equation, is critical as well and should be a priority in terms of all Oregonians. I think close behind that, very close behind that, frankly, is the State Forest HCP process, as well as the Private Forest Accord. State forests don't hold a huge number of those 30 million acres, but to certain communities, they're a big deal, both in terms of those counties that have looked to those lands for their needs for so many decades, as well as those Oregonians that are looking to those lands for recreation, for conservation of species, small but very, very powerful set of acres that affect Oregonians. The Private Forest Accord, I think, is a significant one because we have so many private forest land in Oregon and all across the state that affect Oregons, that they see those lands. As we just talked about earlier, it can affect water quality. And I think on that note, I'll just say, I think we are at a place right now that is probably not too different than where we were at a place 50 years ago when the Forest Practices Act passed. I think we're at a major inflection point right now that could have a really big impact on the future of forestry. We have issues on that have come to a head, climate change, fire, as examples we've talked about. And I think there's an opportunity, especially through this Private Forest Accord, to see wherever it comes out and the implementation of whatever those outcomes are for a potentially very different chart to path with forestry in Oregon, with the potential to affect Oregonians in the long term. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim. Cal, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been trying to think of what's a succinct answer to this question because it is so open-ended. But, really, when I think about it, I live on the coast in Coos Bay. And so I have maybe a little different viewpoint than maybe someone in Portland. But, for example, when you look around our community, you have 80% of the children at Marshfield High are on some sort of subsistence or, meal subsistence. And what that indicates is that our economy is suffering here pretty hard, where we did have a natural resources economy. And, and the lands you manage are well-managed industrial, well-managed lands. And they produce the lumber that used to come through this area. However, when I look at the Oregon as a whole, I have to say climate change is the thing that worries me. And, and I think there's evidence. Some of the evidence we have from that is these large wildfires. And of course, a lot of that large wildfires is not only from climate change, from the heat, it's also from the density of these forests. But, far as what we can do about these things is working on things like the Private Forest Accord, working on implementing, basically the omnibus bill that allowed for a lot of investment in fire protection, working on making our forests more resilient to large forest fires. We also have to be making sure that when we go through these HCP processes, that we make sure that we have older stands, that they're in the right place and to protect the species and just not put out in areas that that may not have as much marginal benefit to what we're trying to achieve. Also, we need to continue to work hard to make sure that we have ample and cool waters, because climate change is going to beat up on these, the salmonids and so on. So what can we do? When you get looking at, and I hate to point fingers, state forestry only manages a portion of the forest in Oregon. And I think 60% of the stands are managed by the federal. And so anything we can do to influence management that deals with climate change on our partners, I think is also important. And I think we can set the example of that on state lands so, I think it's a hard issue, and I don't think I have the succinct answer. I'm going to have to punt and say I'm going to be working with folks. But let me say this. I think part of it's economic. I think, we have the traditional industries. I think also we have new industries that are coming in, bioenergy. I've worked a lot with bioenergy in segment. And I also think that we need to be more conscious about how we create the benefits of environmental, economics, and social through the greatest permanent value. So that's how I would approach it. I think we need to look at that for the Oregonians. And of course, some people from different segments are going to say they want more of this, and other people are going to say they want more of that. But we have to say what's best in creating the greatest permanent value.
Okay, thank you, Cal. Terry, this question is yours now.
Thanks. So the greatest problems facing Oregonians, I think the other two candidates have really summed that up pretty well, but I'll just restate, perhaps in a little bit different way. I think wildfire risk reduction for communities is the number one thing that is on people's minds. But as we're thinking about climate and the shifts that are happening, wildfires, of course, one of the big issues. Heat and the heat dome that we had this year, very unusual and likely something that we'll be dealing with in the future. How do we make sure that our forests are resilient to these fluctuations that are happening with our climate, whether it's a heat dome, wildfire, invasives, wind or ice storms? To have healthy forests, to have forests that can respond resiliently in this type of situation is what I would want to work towards as a state forester. I think addressing climate issues is going to be something that within ODF, there's a way that can be done, but I think some of our more effective ways of doing it will be across the board. Our last question was about water, working with DEQ, working with ODFW, working with all the different state agencies, but also working with our federal partners. A number of years ago, the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment had huge impacts to forestry in Oregon, and the Forest Service is gearing up to redo their forest plans. And so right now, I think is a really good opportunity to take the work that's been happening with the state forest, with the Private Forest Accord, with the Forest Plan for Oregon, the climate plans, and work with the federal agencies that have so much influence on Oregon to really build a system that works for everybody, to really look across boundaries, to work on all lands and address the issues, because state forests are a small part, an important part, but a small part. And private forests are a huge part of this, and they're influenced by, of course, the state policies, but they're also influenced by federal policies. So I think in order to address climate issues, it's going to be important to work across those boundaries and work across the landscape that's out there. I also think really focusing on communities and focusing on counties from a social aspect, from an economic aspect, from a policy standpoint. Ordinances within the communities that really focus on addressing WUI and future placement of buildings and what's expected of people who are choosing to live out in the woods. So, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Terry. And thank you, Paul Betts. That was an excellent question. So right now that's the completion of 4 out of 8 questions that we have. I was just sitting here thinking about, boy, this is intense for the candidate. It's also intense for all of us who are listeners. And I was going to say, maybe we just need to take a couple of deep breaths, but I am reminded that we're a little ahead of schedule. So instead of that, let's take a 5-minute break. And right now, let's say that it is 3:40, maybe it'll be 6 minutes. And let's come back at 3:45. So we're in recess till 3:45. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone, to the Board of Forestry special virtual meeting. And we will return to our public question process. And the next, if Jason, if you can introduce the next panelist, and our order for this time will be Cal first, Terry, then Jim.
Thank you, Chair. The next question is from Carol Valentine. Carol, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us your question?
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Chair Kelly and members of the board for this opportunity to ask a question. I have lived for 25 years on Deer Creek in Selma, down in the Illinois Valley in Southwest Oregon. I am the chair of the Illinois Valley section of the Sierra Club and serve on the Oregon Chapter Sierra Club Conservation Committee. I am the coordinator of the Oregon Chapter's Forest team. And I'm also a steering committee member for the Rural Organizing Working Group of the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance. Some of my question may have been, well, this question ties in with the last one. And it is, what role do you see Oregon's forests playing in mitigating the climate crisis? And how do you envision ODF facilitating that across different land ownership types?
Well, thank you, Carol. And what role? I think first off, when you think about forests, forests are probably are the at least from my viewpoint are the lungs of the earth in a lot of ways. They breathe, they capture carbon, create good air for us to breathe. They protect our watersheds, and so I think anything we can do to create that sustainable ecosystems across the forest landscape, that's what we should be doing as far as our role. It's also mandated by statute that we do that. As far as affecting other, landscapes that are not necessarily directly under our control, I think we can work with them in collaboration on projects. I think down in your area, down in the Illinois Valley, you have a lot of drier ecosystems down there, and are affected heavily by forest fire. So, I think we need to pay some attention to doing some work with the forest restoration forestry down there, so we can improve the resilience. And but I think we have to do that in collaboration with the community and how they get their input. When I worked, when I was the chair of the Metolius River multi-party monitoring team, it was important that we involve the community in our decision making, because there was a lot of things that people were concerned about, and soils and smoke and and then all in water quality and fish and habitat for wildlife, and then also that we produced timber for our economic values down there. But the forest can provide other types of values. And I'm not saying that when I talk about climate change, I don't think that we should be, creating just a young forest. Old forests that maybe don't sequester as much need to be protected too, because when you go in, you can disturb the soil. There's a lot of carbon in those areas, and those things we need to be aware of. So we need to keep a balance on that. I don't have a real quick answer for that, but I would instruct that, we need to keep that balance. We need to provide that protection. We need to keep that leadership in the state of Oregon, that we will create a sustainable forest with a diverse ecosystem across the landscapes.
Okay. Thank you, Cal. Terry, you are up.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the question. So the role of Oregon's forests in mitigating climate crisis. So I think the obvious thing is that I think people have been really focusing on, and appropriately so, is looking at what's happening with the drought, looking at what's happening with fires, and trying to figure out what we can do to help manage that. Of course, there's suppression that happens when a fire starts, but if we can really think about our forests and what we can do to help make them more resilient, whether that's doing that risk level analysis and focusing some attention where it's appropriate on fuels reduction in the forest, definitely in the WUI areas, but also in the forest, prescribed burning where that's appropriate, using as many tools in the toolbox as we can to help forests be more resilient. We currently have a lot of potential for increasing biodiversity in our forests, whether it's state forests or small private landowners or working with the federal government. I think there's an opportunity to really reintroduce a lot of our native species that may not be front and center right now in some of our forests. But in order to be a more resilient ecosystem, I think we really, where we can, where it's possible, where it makes sense to do underplantings and diversify areas such as riparian reserves. There's a no-touch type of a policy currently within a lot of the federal forests for riparian reserves. I'm someone who would advocate for actively managing our riparian to restore them either through stage 0 restoration efforts or whatever kind of restoration would be possible, underplanting some of the more traditional riparian species, but really trying to diversify the forest where we can, where it's important to do that. I think small private landowners and land ownership is a really key part of this. And I think that's where through working with small private landowners, diversifying their forests, maybe assisting with conservation easements or working with them so that once they do harvest, of course, there's a statute that they replant, but how do we incentivize people to keep forestry on those small private landowners in the long run? I think that's one of the more vulnerable areas, just from an economic standpoint, for people who have, that are thinking there's a lot of generational turnover. So I think that's a big part of what we need to be focusing on. I think there's ways to work with the federal agencies again, the Good Neighbor Authority, Stewardship Timber Sales, the stewardship agreement that was written. So I think there's a lot of potential to work again across all lands and to do some ecologically based restoration that will make the forest more resilient. And I didn't start my clock, so I don't know if I'm done. So thanks.
I assume you are done then. Okay, Terry, thank you. Jim, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Carol. Boy, what a tremendous question to answer in 3 minutes. So I think I'll be talking mostly big picture in terms of what I see are kind of the major pieces, components here to this question. Role of Oregon's forests in mitigating climate crisis. I think first and foremost, fundamentally, it's about doing everything feasible that we can to mitigate, to ensure that we're seeing a net growth in carbon storage. And what we can means what can we do as Oregonians, right? We can't solve the whole problem of the country or the world, of course, but we can do our part. And I think in coming up with what does that mean, doing what's feasible, there's two big buckets, right? There's storage, but there's also emissions. So in the context of the Board of Forestry, it's bringing that information in a way that people feel confident that it's the best information out there. There's general agreement. There's not going to be a consensus, right? With this kind of issue, but general agreement, and making sure we're thinking about all the different pieces. And then over time, making sure that over time, we know if we're mitigating, we know if that's happening, some kind of dashboard, some kind of indicators that show us over time, are we actually making a difference, or we just think we are? We need real metrics, as real as we can get. Both above ground storage and below ground storage, when we talk about storage, and then finally, I think, one of the big pieces about climate change the biggest piece is the health of our world, right, and the longevity of our ecosystem as a global ecosystem. But it comes down to people that are getting impacted by that as well. And we need to make sure that as we do that, as Oregonians, we're taking care of each other as we do that. There are big changes that have to be made in terms of our economy, in terms of carbon markets, that both urban and rural alike, we have those communities in mind and are being aware of any potential unintended consequences, so that we're not causing potentially more harm to people, maybe in the short term, than we thought was happening or than we intended to at all, and are keeping an eye on rural communities and how we go about that. And ultimately, it's about doing it in a way that creates has a durability to it of our forest ecosystems, that we are maintaining, sustaining forest lands in Oregon in a durable way that are going to persist over time. And that in addition to climate change, right, we have all these other demands from the public around what they want to see in their forests, around habitat, around recreation, around wood fiber. So yeah, if it was an easy question to answer, we wouldn't be sort of launching down that path. And what I've seen the board starting to launch down that path is, what are we going to do about it? But we need to try, and we need to keep, I think, those big pieces in mind as we move forward with that work.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Okay, we're going to move to the next question, our question number 6. And Terry will be up first on this one, then Jim, then Cal. And Jason, can you introduce our panelist, please?
Sure. Next up is Brett Brownscombe. Brett, are you there?
Here. Yeah. Hello.
Introduce yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Well, thank you. So my name is Brett Brownscombe. I work for the Wild Salmon Center, and we're a conservation nonprofit organization that works to protect and conserve wild salmon rivers and their ecosystems, including forests, from California on up through Canada into Alaska and across to Russia, across the Pacific Rim. And I first wanted to thank all of the finalists, congrats on getting through the initial vetting and into the final rounds, and then B, thanks for, no job interview is easy, and especially one that's subjected to public vetting. Cheers and thank you. And then also thanks to Chair Kelly and the board for having a public process on this important decision regarding the next state forester for Oregon. So Wild Salmon Center's question, it relates to a term of art, but also a term that's core to the management of state public forests. And also the question relates to a more global issue that has been touched on a lot here today. Here's the question. Please summarize your vision of management of the state forests under greatest permanent value. What is the role of timber harvest as compared to other values that the forest provides? And does the climate crisis affect your understanding of the management of state forests? And if so, how? And thank you.
I'll start. Hi, Brett. Thank you for the question. My vision for the management of state forests. Well, the state forests are, of course, a resource for for all Oregonians. We receive water, clean air, recreation opportunities, and communities are dependent upon the state forests for timber, not only for building material, and that gets sent out all over, but the system that's in place, the trust that the communities have given to the Board of Forestry and to ODF is to manage those lands for greatest permanent value, which does include timber harvest. I don't think it means timber harvest on every piece of land. I think it means optimizing timber harvest where it's appropriate and optimizing other resources where it's appropriate. But because of the trust responsibility that the counties have with the Board of Forestry and ODF. I think it's really a critical part of the vision for the management of the state forests, that we understand that timber harvesting is a big part of the responsibility of state forests. So as far as how does that work in with the climate crisis, right now, a lot of salvage is happening. And so the big emphasis has turned from green lumber to salvage. And I think everyone concerned would prefer to have forests that are green instead of forests that are being salvaged. So my vision for the management of the state forest is to recognize the socioeconomic needs of the communities, but also to address the climate crisis through looking at the way that we're managing our forests, looking at what parts of the forest might be better managed for timber and what might be better managed for drinking water or endangered species or any of the other ecological services that take place. So although the state forests are a small part of the overall structure of Oregon's forests, it's a responsibility, I think, of ODF to manage it in a way that works for not only the big picture Oregonians, but also the communities and the counties that depend on the state forest for revenue. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. Okay, go ahead, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Brett. Again, that's a great question. That's a tough one to tackle in 3 minutes. I think with this question, on the one hand, as I talked about earlier, I'm thinking about what is the issue at hand and what's the governing body that really is the body charged to speaking with that. This is clearly a vision for state forests is squarely in the Board of Forestry's realm of debating and confirming that vision with the support of the department, obviously, in doing that work. But I do have some thoughts that I will share. It's a very difficult task for the Board of Forestry for obvious reasons. It's been difficult for quite a while. The board's supposed to represent the voice of all Oregonians. And we have a lot of different voices and a lot of different demands on those forests. And I think the debate that's happening today around state forests is different from, let's say, 20 years ago, when the Department of Forestry first launched into the structure-based management idea and first started to pursue this very different way of managing forests, which at the time was uncharted territory. I mean, prior to the 90s, it was all about timber. It was all about volume. And structure-based management was this, some thought, crazy new idea. How is this going to work, right? I think we're in a very different context right now, and it's important to acknowledge the context. Because I experienced this context as the director of the Department of State Lands when we were wrestling with the Elliott State Forest and how to deal with that issue. We have a forest land base on our state forest lands that have a growing number of endangered species on them. You could argue significantly more species and habitat than 20 years ago. And because of the laws of the Land for Endangered Species Act, as well as just public expectations and the shift in public opinions about forestry, the shift in public expectations of publicly owned forests. It is more difficult to manage for fiber right now versus other benefits on those forest lands versus the other parts of the greatest permanent value. And it will get more and more difficult. The status quo, which again, I experienced on the Elliott State Forest, status quo is a continuing growth of those trees, continuing expansion of species to be protected that really narrow options. If you want to talk about the 3 legs of the stool, it really comes down to more of the 2 legs the longer you wait. So in terms of thinking about what's the vision now versus the past, I think whatever that balance is going to be, I think it is much more imperative now that that the board have that conversation, that we look at the information, you look at the trajectory those forests are on. And if you do want to maintain all of those legs of the stool in best way possible, the HCP appears to be the best path forward, right, in terms of assuring that that active management in whatever form that is and whatever balance we have of those values is probably the most likely way where we are going to come to potentially some predictability on those lands around what is going to be provided. Not everyone I know in the debate necessarily agrees with that answer and is excited about an HCP, although there are a lot of people that are, of course, this debate around HCP has been going on for 20 years, but we're in a very different context right now than we were 20 years ago. And in many respects, the options are limiting around how this is defined and what future outcomes would occur on those forests. So again, I think it's ultimately a Board of Forestry vision that has to be arrived at with the state forester and the support of the department in that endeavor for the board. And the clock is ticking, and I believe it's something that's critical to happen sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you. Cal, it's your turn. You're bite at the apple here.
Okay, I'm biting the apple right now, Chair Kelly. What my vision, you asked my vision of what state forest should be, and I'm going to tell you what my vision would be, is that I'm driving out to the state forest and I see an eagle fly by. I'm seeing salmon going up the stream with a nice protected stream, clean water. I'm breathing fresh air. And then I come around the corner, I see a nice feller buncher out there doing a little thinning. They're dragging logs down to the landing. There's a team of loggers making a living at this, hauling logs down to the lumber mill, and someone's actually taking care of the hog fuel because they got a biomass plant down the road and making electricity. And then you look on top of the ridge tops, there's corridors, there's reserves that are stuck, or in the right position to make sure that we have habitat for species. And then I look down the streams and someone's thinning those darn stands right next because they want to grow larger trees. So there's some innovative adaptive management going on. That's my vision, something like that. But, I think it was properly said that a lot of this is going to be dependent upon because there are so many different demands on the forest, and we're going to have to go through the public process and find out what we can do. But I agree. I think HCP is the way to go forward, because once you get the HCP on there, your decision is you can make these decisions within the HCP, and you don't have to fight every time. It's I think this fighting every time you have to do a treatment in the forest is very limiting. Finally, I would say that we need to look at the greatest permanent value rule again. I keep going back to that, but it says that the state forester needs at least every 10 years look at how you're doing. I think we need to look more often, and that's through monitoring and so on and so forth, how we're doing. So maybe I come around the corner, I say, we need to monitor this, as a state forester. And I think we need to have that active, I heard the word dashboard, I like that, that tells us how we're doing. So that's my vision. I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but that's how I look at forests.
Okay, thank you, Cal. We are 3/4 of the way through. You're all doing great. Thank you to everybody for hanging in there. The next question, Jim, you'll go first, then Terry, then Cal. And Jason, do you want to introduce our next panelist?
Sure. So our next panelist was not able to be here today, so I will read the question on their behalf. This question is from Carrie Rain, who's a business owner. How will you meet the challenge of managing a sustainable timber production so there will be clean drinking water in all Oregon's communities, continuation of the diversity of plants, fish, and wildlife, and ensure that more carbon is tied up in Oregon's forests to address climate change?
Okay, Jim.
Okay. Another great question. I think part of the answer to this question comes back to what does the Board of Forestry and the Department of Forestry again have where is our legal authority, where is our reach, where is our influence around forests in Oregon? and make sure that's our priority and our focus in terms of these producing those outcomes on the forest in that question. And as we said, as someone mentioned earlier, with 60% of the forested landscape, federal forests are the big, elephant in the room. They have a huge impact. State forests, the department and the board have the most direct ability to impact. And then private forests is the next in terms of the indirect ability. In some ways, very direct when it comes to making sure minimum, that the laws, environmental laws are enforced and followed, but indirect in terms of influencing or incentivizing landowners to go above and beyond those minimum laws. So I think in that context, I would point to the private forest accord work as really one of the key places that question will be answered, and the outcomes of that work. I understand that the Department of Forestry is, for the most part, an observer and a supporter of information to that work, and where that goes is largely dependent on the players that are at the table. But I think what comes out of that accord and ultimately what we as a state are looking at implementing, I think we should look through the lens of all three of those things. And I didn't have time to write them all down, but I think it was the climate change, the clean water, and the species protections. And again, coming back to some sort of dashboard, and I think for the Board of Forestry, this may feed into your FPFO work. I know the dashboard that's there is huge, hard to call a dashboard. There are so many metrics in that report. But as you look at updating and revising and potentially paring that down to some core metrics, I think that's one place you can look to share your vision and also look to metrics that you're going to follow up on in the future to see if the department and the state as a whole is achieving the outcomes on those important pieces of public expectations that you want to see, be it the private forests, but state forests and potentially federal forests as well, in terms of whatever type of indirect influence or informal influence we can have on the federal lands as a state. I think I went a little over on my last question, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Terry?
Thanks. So meeting the challenge of sustainable timber production, again, I talked earlier about all lands, but I think it is important to work across boundaries. And so that would be a cornerstone. Private forests, I think, is a big emphasis for sustainable timber production. The private forests do produce the majority of the product, and working with the timber industry, if the private forest accord moves positively through the process and the entities are able to come up with an agreement and get an HCP, that would be ideal. If that doesn't happen, I think working with private forests, there's the private forest companies are so diverse. And so I think working with them and doing what we can to incentivize addressing climate and carbon in forests, I think is going to be important. I think working with small landowners, again, making sure that once they do harvest, that if they are economically motivated to sell the property, that there's some kind of incentive to keep it in forestry. I think that's really important. Carbon in forests is, of course, one way to address carbon, but also carbon in forest products. I think looking at some of the emerging technology with mass timber, looking at how we can replace some of the building material over the years and go back the years to construction material that's based out of wood. On a personal note, as I was trying to reduce my personal footprint, I found myself using less plastic and using more wood products, using more paper products. So I think as we are looking at our use of things, and I think there's going to be an emerging market that maybe isn't addressed right now. So I think looking at sustainable timber production, not in the context of today, but really thinking about sustainable forestry and where Oregon forests have a competitive advantage, and moving towards that, and whether that's continuing with what we're doing now, whether it's longer rotation or possibly longer rotations some places and shorter rotations in others. I think we really need to look at all the tools that are out there. And I think we need to incentivize people to work with us and keep the focus on maintaining carbon in forests and in forest products that work. So thanks.
Thank you, Terry. Cal, you're up next.
Okay, so the question is revolving around keeping forests accumulating carbon in order to battle climate change. And I think that's a good goal. I think when we come to state lands, we need to do all that to create the resiliency on state lands to fight to resist fires, to continue to be healthy, to continue to grow in respect to other needs from the forest. On private lands, I'm hoping for the private forest accord. But I think that I'm going to make this short. I think if we want to keep have the forest continue to work on absorbing carbon, we need to keep forests, and that's something that we need to be able to help and do. And anything we can do that helps private landowners maintain those forests in healthy manner so they can afford to keep it forests, I think is a good thing, and something that we can do through education. We can do through listening to what is needed out there. And on state lands, I think we just need to be able to operate within the parameters by which we're given, respecting species, water, and also the need for timber harvest. So real short, that's how I would approach it. Keep forests.
Great. Thank you, Cal. Okay, we are ready for our very last question. And this one we'll have in the order of Cal, Jim, and then Terry to wrap us up. And Jason, have you got a panelist lined up?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I do. This question was submitted by Tony Meekum, who also wasn't able to be here today. So I'll read this question for him. And this was as submitted. Oregon is the only state on the West Coast that relies completely on federal funds to promote urban forestry when the state is booming in urban population. Oregon has neglected the urban forests, besides 2 outstanding community foresters, and is not doing enough to promote the forests that impact millions of Oregonians who live in urban settings. For many of them, these are the only trees they see. These trees are the beating heart of healthy urban environments. For everything involved in urban forestry beyond the typical plant trees slogan, how will the new state forester leverage state dollars and advocate for the promotion and outreach of the urban forest, including long-term planning, maintenance, infrastructure capital projects, stormwater management, and so much more?
Well, that's a big question. And, I did urban forestry when I worked for Colorado State Forest Service, and that's a real important aspect of a forester's job. In fact, if you're a forester and you're living in an urban area, you have to look at the trees in your community like a complete forest, and how do you approach it? And it's important. Now, I have to admit, I don't know the specifics of the budgetary and how urban forestry is financed. I do think it's really important. It has the capability of reducing our need for energy uses in homes. It's important for communities to have that. And then when you talk about climate change, it's very important, a good urban forestry program. Another aspect of urban forestry is that, when you're doing tree trimmings and so on, to get those tree trimmings off to compost, or better yet, to a bioenergy plant where they can create some products that can come out of that, and diverting them from the wood waste, from going into waste product streams, is very important. I think that should be considered a part of the urban forestry program. One thing that comes across my mind, I had a tree trimming crew that on the streets when I was working in Colorado, and I had a college professor come out and say, when you trim those trees, are you hurting them? And he was serious. And so we had this philosophical discussion, but I was able to talk about urban forestry and how trimming trees is a good thing. And that's the thing, part of it's also going to be about education and getting people familiar with trees. Urban areas, I think that's really important that they understand that these trees are important. So I'm in favor of that. Okay, that's it. I won't say anything more.
All right, Jim.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think this is, this is a big challenge for Department of Forestry. I think in large part because you were to poll the general public, however you define that. A lot of folks out there don't even know the difference between the Department of Forestry and state or national forest lands. I get that a lot from friends and even family. They sort of juggle the two between. So and a lot of that, I think, misunderstanding or just lack of familiarity, I would guess, comes from urban environments where folks aren't connected, aren't really aware of all that Department of Forestry does or is, because it just doesn't touch their world. I talked about earlier with the increasing intensity of fire seasons, that's starting to change from a fire perspective. But I think to really make some headway into advocating for urban forestry, the department's going to really have to invest some energy into connecting with urban populations, really, and letting them know, helping them understand why urban forests matter. And also, some of them won't need that kind of convincing because they understand it. But I think a bigger issue is would the Department of Forestry's role be in those environments? How would we expand and advocate, and what would we do? Again, probably ultimately a Board of Forestry question. I think you're talking about raising awareness amongst a whole other constituency in Oregon. And I think if just some thoughts off the top of my head on how to do that, I think we need to leverage resources, state resources with local city resources to sort of get our foot in the door and work on that. Forest ODF does have a small presence. Obviously, we do have a presence in urban forestry now. A lot of room for growth, I think. But a difficult nut to crack simply because of where we're starting at with the general public in terms of just their knowledge of the department, which I think is also a greater issue that would be worth diving into and talking about in terms of the future of forestry in Oregon and the department's role and the board's role is how to expand sort of the awareness and importance of the department's work to Oregonians in general.
Thank you, Jim. Terry?
I'm delighted to see urban forestry as one of the topics. I started my career in urban forestry, and my first job was as a maintenance man for a public works department, and I was the lead chainsaw operator, and that was a number of years ago. But as far as planning and maintenance and all the different aspects of urban forestry, I think working with the limited number of folks that already occur at ODF, but the arborist profession is very tight, and they really do work well with each other and support each other's programs. So I think stimulating those professional meetings and relationships, working with public works departments, recreation, parks and rec departments within cities, counties, communities, you can expand the urban forestry program. I think stormwater is something that's not necessarily something that a lot of urban foresters are addressing, but it's something that I think could be a really important part of a larger stormwater program, is to really think about utilizing some of the urban spaces to address some of the stormwater issues. I think about sisters and some of their urban plantings, which are also stormwater drains that have really great impact in the area, not only for recreation and visual aesthetics, but also for stormwater management. So I think stimulating and identifying those urban forestry practices that work really well, I think is a really important thing to do. I think one of the biggest things that could happen with urban forestry is bridging the urban-rural divide. I think one of the biggest issues that we have in Oregon is the urban-rural divide. and people's appreciation in urban areas for forests and forestry, and people in rural areas understanding or desire to understand the urban context of things. So I think urban forestry, environmental education, which can be a big part of urban forestry, could go a long way to supporting not only the urban forestry programs in urban areas and communities, but also really helping to educate about forestry and forests and why they're important, not only in urban areas, but throughout the state. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. So at this point, this concludes the public panel portion. I'd just like to say one thing, which is, these were all questions that came from the public. Majority of them did come from what appeared to be the conservation community. But I was given these questions without being able to identify where they came from, and so then help select the actual questions. I'm surprised that many of these questions, I couldn't really tell whether they were coming from a conservation point of view or from an industry or rural community point of view. And so I'm kind of surprised today that so many, pretty much most of them did come from environmental advocates in the conservation community. I guess that's a good thing that people were giving many of them were the kind of questions that they weren't obvious to me, but there wasn't really an intention here to not have questions coming from a timber point of view. So I apologize that it kind of came out that way. It certainly was not my intention. So that said, I think we've got enough time. We're scheduled to break at 4:45, and we do have enough time, if they are willing, for each of our candidates to have 5 minutes to wrap up. I know, when I'm put on the spot, it's usually right after I'm no longer on the spot that I think of that thing I should have said in answer to some questions. So I'm kind of going to guess that the candidates may have a few of those, and this would be your opportunity to for that or anything else. So I will go ahead. Let's have Cal go first here, if you're willing, and you can talk for up to 5 minutes or not. If any of you don't, you'll get bonus points because we're going to have a longer break.
Well, thank you, Chair Kelly, and the board. This has been I guess there was a song by by the Grateful Dead said this is a long, strange journey. So, I think that this has been it's been great. I think going through this process has been great. And as I look at myself, potentially being the state forester, I see that as a tough but very rewarding job. And we got some problems out there, and we still continue to have a lot of controversy in on state forest lands and what we're supposed to do, and it's tough. But there's a lot of positive things I've seen that happened over the last few years since I was on the Board of Forestry. And then I went on to the parks, and everybody loves parks, and that was nice. But in fact, I recommend it to all BOF people, go to parks afterwards. But, I think my strength for you guys is, I may not know a lot of the very technical things, but I do have a vision on how forestry should operate. I also have I've been on the outside, I've been on the inside, I've worked in private situations, I've worked with government situations, I've worked with tribes, I've worked with stakeholders. And that's one thing I think that the Board of Forestry needs is someone who can go out there and talk with the public and work with people. One of the things that I've been a CEO of corporations, and one of the main things you need to do in large corporations is create that leadership, to tell them where they're going and which way we're going to go and how we're going to do that. But beyond that, you have a lot of people who are expertise, and you have to direct them on the outcomes, and monitor their progress. But you don't have to get in there and get into the works and work on things. That's some of you look at some of the great leaders, that they were very good at expressing what the objectives are. And I think working with your board, working with that, you can come back and give that type of direction. But on the other side, the way the organization is set up, ODF, it allows the state forester to be very external too, and working on external issues. And I think that's something that we need to focus on. But initially, when I look at this potential position, I see we need to get the patients on the table. We need to get the patient breathing well and standing up and moving on. And those are the sort of things I think that initially we need to focus on. But I look at the future right now, and it looks bright. I mean, everything's kind of in place for the next state forester to be successful. And I have to applaud the board, have to applaud the leadership for making that possible. So thank you for this opportunity, and I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Okay, thank you, Cal. It's great. Terry, do you want to go next?
Sure. Just wanted to thank everyone for this opportunity to interview for the position. I consider it a real honor to be a finalist. Part of the process here was being interviewed by some of the employees. And at the end of my interview, I interviewed them back. And I asked them what they were looking for in a state forester, the quality, if they could pick one, what they would want. And they listed a number of things. I just wanted the board to hear this. So they want a decision maker. They want a visionary realist, a good communicator who's also a good listener to internal, external, and partners, who seeks innovative solutions, values relationships, has a strong voice to move ODF forward, who has strong, broad shoulders and very thick skin. So I thought that would be good to share with the board and also to the other finalists. I'm very interested in this position. I think with my background of forestry and biology, having worked in Clean Water Act and ecology, I have skills that are needed right now to move us forward. We're on the precipice of moving forward with the HCP for the state forests. We've got a hopefully evolving, emerging one with private forests. And I've been working on both, and I feel very comfortable, very confident in the work that ODF has been doing, particularly with the state forests. They have not only created a collaborative process within the state agencies and federal agencies, but they are now currently going back and ground truthing it, making sure that it works with the people on the ground who have to implement it. So I think we're really on the verge of having a very successful kind of new age of managing the forest with the habitat conservation plans. I'm very interested also in the shift to climate smart forestry. I think that's something that will be evolving over time as we're learning about all the different aspects and the impacts of climate change on forests, forest management, air quality, water quality. And that's a significant interest of mine. I have a background in traditional forestry, but also in non-traditional forestry, working with communities and international communities developing non-timber forest products or special forest products from an economic standpoint, but also with ecological base so that it's something that's sustainable over time. I'm someone who is very much a facilitator of processes. I have a lot of ideas and a lot of opinions, but my preference is to facilitate others to work together and come up with ways to move forward. I think those facilitation skills and my desire to address tough issues is a reason why I would be a good state forester. I think you do have three good candidates here. I think you're in a very good position. And if I'm chosen, I would be happy to serve as the next state forester. Thanks. And I gave you a minute and a half, so I get extra points.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. I think Cal left a little time on the table there too. So Jim, go ahead.
Yes. So I'll say thank you as well to the board, to the panelists, and to the ODS staff that I know this last month has been as busy for some of you as it's been for us candidates. I guess a few thoughts to end with here. One, I've been around 3 different agencies. I've been through a lot of different budget cycles. I've seen a lot of and observed different agencies from a distance. And when in this process, when I was bringing myself up to speed on the current status of the board and the department, I was frankly floored at the incredible number of major initiatives you have on your plate. I mean, pick 2 or 3 of those alone, and that would be a big deal for an agency to work with. That's a lot to juggle, and I think it's a symptom of things that have been probably pushed off for too long and just not resolved, and it builds up. So you've got a big plate to deal with. Definitely a big challenge for a state forester, new state foresters to step into and work with you on. Having said that, I think this is a very unique job, and that sounds cliche-ish, but here's why. This is a job, and actually was evident in your position description. The board is looking for someone who's potentially the best forester or with the technical knowledge around this field, has the best skills around being a chief executive officer, and knows how to run a large organization, knows how to move people and make things happen in an organization aligned with their vision, their mission, their values, and a person who's skilled at being the secretary to a board like the Board of Forestry with huge visibility, whole bunch of stakeholders, differing opinions. This position really needs to have someone that has skills in all 3 of those areas, because no one area can, if you fall down in any one area, a person will struggle. I think it's a struggle. And specifically around moving an organization, I think, it's important not to underestimate with all of these major issues on your plate, even if they do get to, if and when they do get to resolution around, be it statutes or rules or new policy or new FPFO, then comes the hard work, right? Then the leader of the agency needs to translate that into work the organization has to do and accomplish those things, implement and realize those goals. There's a great quote I came across from Henry Kissinger around leadership relative to this. And it goes, I just want to read it here. That's all about the people, right? He says, the task of the leader is to get their people from where they are to where they have not been. And I think on so many of these issues, forestry is going to need to get their people to where they have not been, because this board is discussing issues where we potentially are going in new directions that we haven't gone to before in Oregon. So I think it's critical you have a leader, whoever your selection is, really that can do that task. And finally, I also want to comment on kind of the moment you're in right now. And this is from a history of working with boards and seeing boards turn over and directors turn over. As I look at the 6 members of this board, and you have one more coming on potentially, I think in November, maybe December, you have the potential to have the same group of people on this board for 5 years, with a new state forester coming in to work with that group for 5 years. That will be there for 5 years. And if I were lucky enough to get the position, I would hope it'd be much longer than 5 years. And when I think of that, what an incredible opportunity. That scenario really excites me. And I have a number of years left in my career, but if I were to be so lucky to have this opportunity, that would be what I would devote it to, and being in that role for as long as I could to make a difference. Because what a chance to make a legacy, what a chance to really turn the corner and solve some big issues in Oregon with forestry that really hasn't been there for quite a while. And I would welcome it and be excited about it.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So with that, I will close item 2, as the board will now have an executive session pursuant to ORS 192.660 parentheses 2 parentheses A and 192.660 parentheses 7. Representatives of the news media, invited agency partners, and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the public are not allowed to join. Before the board members leave this meeting and join the executive session, I would like to thank the members of the public and presenters for their engagement with today's topics, as the public portion of our meeting has concluded. I would just like to say, you know, this whole public hiring process, wow, it's difficult and it's weird, and you really have to applaud the finalists that we have for going through this, for putting yourselves out there. You're all well qualified, and we can only hire one of you, which is really frustrating. But I think you need to be thanked for having to go through this on behalf of the people of Oregon, as well as my fellow board members. So with that, we'll conclude this meeting, and we're asking the 3 of you to join us in the executive session. That executive session will start at 5 o'clock Pacific Coast time, Terry. All right, that's in about 15 minutes. We're right on time. Thank you all. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.